I'm Marcus Thompson, 46, and I built my construction company from nothing 16-hour days, calloused hands, and a dream that nearly broke me. When my sister Claire showed up at my office with a lawyer, demanding half of everything I'd earned, I thought it was a joke. Family shares everything, she said, waving papers like she owned the place. The same sister who'd laughed when I started laying foundations in my 20s, while she chased art degrees. The same sister who'd ignored my calls when I was eating ramen for dinner and sleeping in my truck. But what happened in that courtroom 3 weeks later would expose a truth about my family that shattered everything I thought I knew and gave me the justice I never expected. If you've ever felt betrayed by those closest to you, you'll understand why this story had to be told. The faded business license still hangs in my office, yellowed at the edges and bearing the signature of a younger, more hopeful Marcus Thompson. I was 24 when I filed those papers, standing in the county clerk's office with sweaty palms, and a check that represented every dollar I'd saved from 3 years of working construction for other people. Growing up in the Thompson household meant understanding your place in the hierarchy early. Dad worked the assembly line at the auto plant, coming home with grease under his fingernails and stories about union disputes. Mom cleaned houses for the wealthy families on the hill, always commenting on their beautiful things and how someday, maybe, we lived in a modest ranch house with avocado green appliances and carpet that had seen better decades. Claire was 2 years younger than me, born with what my mother called artistic sensitivity, where I was rough around the edges, building tree houses and getting into scraps. Claire painted watercolors and wrote poetry. She had this way of tilting her head when she spoke, like she was listening to music the rest of us couldn't hear. Mom and Dad ate it up. Claire's going to be special, Dad would say, watching her sketch at the kitchen table. She's got real talent. Meanwhile, I'd be fixing the leaky faucet or patching holes in the drywall, useful but unremarkable. When high school guidance counselors asked about college plans, I shrugged. College was for kids like Claire, kids with potential. I was good with my hands, good at figuring out how things worked and how to fix them when they broke. Construction seemed like the logical path. Claire, on the other hand, was destined for art school, not just any art school, the expensive private college 3 states away that specialized in fine arts. The tuition alone was more than Dad made in a year, but somehow, they made it work. Second mortgages, borrowed money from relatives, Mom picking up extra cleaning jobs. It's an investment in her future, Mom would say, counting bills at the kitchen table. She's going to do great things. I graduated high school and immediately started working for Brennan Construction, learning the trade from the ground up. While Claire was studying color theory and art history, I was hauling materials, mixing concrete, and slowly understanding that building things, really building them to last, was what I was meant to do. The day I decided to start my own company, I was sitting in my beat-up Ford pickup, eating a gas station sandwich and watching the crew work on a commercial project. The general contractor was a guy named Peterson who treated his workers like dirt and cut corners everywhere he could. I watched him use substandard materials and knew the building wouldn't last 5 years before problems started showing up. That's when it hit me. I could do this better. Not just the construction part, but the whole business. I could build things the right way, treat people fairly, and create something that would last. The business license cost $50. I had exactly $53 in my checking account. Claire was finishing her second year of art school when I filed the paperwork for Thompson Construction. She called that same week, excited about a study abroad program in Italy. It's only $8,000, she said, as if that was pocket change. Mom and Dad are looking into it. I remember sitting in my empty apartment studio above a pizza shop holding the phone and feeling something twist in my chest. $8,000 for a semester in Italy. I was sleeping on a mattress on the floor and eating cereal for dinner, but somehow Claire's dreams were always the priority. That's great, Claire, I said, because what else could I say? Italy sounds amazing. You should come visit me, she said. You'd love the architecture there. All those old buildings. I almost laughed. A plane ticket to Italy would have bankrupted me. But Claire lived in a world where things like that were possibilities, not pipe dreams. After I hung up, I looked at my business license again. Thompson Construction. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I had no employees, no equipment, no office. Just a name on a piece of paper and a stubborn belief that I could build something better. The first few years were brutal. I took any job I could get: small repairs, bathroom renovations, basement waterproofing. I worked 7 days a week, often until dark, saving every penny I could. When I finally saved enough to buy my first work truck, I slept in it to save. On rent, Claire sent postcards from Italy, pictures of the Sistine Chapel, the Colosseum, smiling photos of her with other art students, having the most incredible experience. She wrote, "This is changing my life." I was happy for her. I really was Spania. But I also wondered what it would feel like to have a family that believed in your dreams the way they believed in hers. Claire's art school diploma hangs framed in my parents' living room, right above the mantel where our family photos used to be. It's a beautiful piece of paper-heavy stock, embossed lettering, signed by the dean of one of the most prestigious art schools in the country. It cost them $43,000. I know the exact amount because I helped Dad figure out the loan paperwork when he refinanced the house for the third time. She's worth every penny, he said, signing his name with the same careful precision he used on his time card at the plant. Are Claire's going to be somebody? The diploma represents everything about how our family worked. Claire was the investment, the future, the one who would lift us all up. I was the dependable one, the one who would always be okay, who didn't need special attention or financial sacrifice, the one who could take care of himself. When Claire graduated, the whole family drove down for the ceremony. Mom bought a new dress, the first one I'd seen her purchase in years. Dad took time off work, something he never did unless someone was in the hospital. They sat in those folding chairs, beaming with pride, as Claire walked across the stage in her cap and gown, ready to take on the art world. I was proud of her too, genuinely. She'd worked hard, created beautiful things, and earned her degree. But sitting there in the auditorium, I couldn't help but think about my own graduation from high school, a quick ceremony, followed by dinner at Applebee's. No fanfare, no celebration, just the assumption that I'd figure things out on my own. After the ceremony, we all went to dinner at an expensive restaurant near campus. Claire was glowing, surrounded by her artist friends who spoke in terms I didn't understand, and conceptual frameworks in emerging markets. They were all from families that could afford to let their children pursue their passions without worrying about practical things like rent or grocery bills. Marcus builds things, Claire said, when someone asked what I did. There was something in her tone, not mean, exactly, but dismissive. Like building things was quaint, simple, not quite worthy of the same respect as creating art. Construction work, I clarified. I have my own company. That's nice, one of her friends said. The way you'd compliment someone's hobby. Very practical, Claire laughed, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach. She was embarrassed by me, her brother who worked with his hands, who smelled like sawdust and paint, who didn't understand the difference between abstract expressionism and postmodernism. I was the blue-collar brother who didn't fit into her elevated world. The pattern continued after graduation. Claire moved to the city, getting a studio apartment in the trendy arts district. Mom and Dad helped with the deposit, of course. She worked part-time at a gallery while pursuing her own art, sending home photos of her paintings and sculptures. They were good. I could see that even though I didn't understand the deeper meaning everyone else seemed to find in them, but good wasn't enough to pay the bills. Gallery jobs barely covered coffee money, and selling original art was harder than anyone expected. So Claire started a small business, hand-painting custom ceramics for restaurants and boutiques. It was commercial work, the kind of thing her art school professors had probably warned her against, but it paid better than waiting tables. For a while, it seemed like she was finding her way. The ceramic business grew slowly but steadily. She'd hired an assistant, moved to a bigger studio, started talking about expanding into home goods. Mom and Dad were thrilled their artistic daughter was also a successful businesswoman. Then came the first loan request. Just to get through a rough patch, Claire explained during a family dinner. The holiday season was slower than expected. $5,000, which might as well have been $5 million to my parents. But they found a way, liquidating Dad's small retirement fund to help their daughter. The second loan came 6 months later, then a third. Each time, Claire had explained, said big client who was late paying, unexpected equipment costs, a marketing campaign that didn't work out. Each time, Mom and Dad found the money somewhere, borrowing against the house or cashing in savings, bonds they'd been keeping for emergencies. I started my own company around the same time Claire started hers, but no one ever asked if I needed help. The assumption was that I was tough, practical, capable of handling whatever came my way. When I slept in my truck or ate ramen for dinner, it was just part of the process. The expected struggle of building something from nothing. When Claire struggled, it was a crisis that required family intervention. I didn't resent her for it, not exactly. She was my sister, and I wanted her to succeed. But I couldn't help noticing the difference in how our challenges were treated. My problems were character building. Hers were obstacles that needed to be removed. The ceramic business eventually failed, as I suspected it would. Claire had talent, but she didn't have the business sense or the discipline to make it work long term. She was an artist trying to be an entrepreneur, and the two skill sets don't always overlap. She's going back to school, Mom announced during one of our monthly dinners, getting her master's degree in fine arts. It'll open up more opportunities. Another degree. Another $40,000 in debt. Another chance for Claire to find herself while the rest of us figured out how to pay for it. I was building my third house by then, a custom home for a young family who'd saved 4 years to afford it. I was proud of the work, proud of the business. I was slowly building. But when I tried to share that pride with my family, I could see their eyes glaze over. Construction was just construction. Art was art. Claire got her master's degree and moved to another city, following opportunities that never quite materialized. She taught art classes at a community college, worked as a freelance designer, tried her hand at gallery. Each job was temporary, a stepping stone to something better that never quite appeared. And through it all, Mom and Dad supported Hera financially, emotionally, unconditionally. Their golden child could do no wrong, even when she was clearly struggling to find her place in the world. I kept building houses. The contract that changed everything is still in my office safe. Signed and dated 15 years ago. Henderson Commercial Plaza, modest strip mall project that most contractors would have considered routine. For me, it was the break I'd been grinding toward for 7 years. By then, I'd built a reputation for reliability and quality work, mostly through word of mouth and the kind of stubborn persistence that comes from having no safety net. While other contractors cut corners to maximize profits, I did the opposite. I used better materials, took more time, and stood behind every job with a warranty that made other builders nervous. It wasn't always profitable. There were months when I barely broke even. When I had to choose between paying myself and keeping my crew employed, I always chose my crew. Good workers were hard to find, and I'd learned that treating people fairly was not just the right thing to do, it was good business. The Henderson project came through Jim Bradley, a client I'd done a kitchen renovation for 2 years earlier. He was a property developer who'd been watching my work and liked what he saw. When he decided to build a small commercial complex, he called me instead of putting it out for bid. "I want someone who'll do it right," he said during our first meeting. "Not cheap, not fast, but right. Can you handle something this size?" The project was bigger than anything I'd taken on before, 40,000 square feet of retail space, proper commercial infrastructure, a timeline that stretched over 8 months. The contract was worth more than I'd made in the previous 2 years combined. I spent 3 sleepless nights going over the plans, calculating costs, figuring out logistics. I had to hire additional crew, rent equipment I'd never used before, coordinate with subcontractors who specialized in commercial work. It was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. The day we broke ground, I stood in the empty lot at sunrise, watching my crew set up equipment and lay out the foundation markers. This was at the moment when Thompson Construction stopped being a one-man operation and became a real business. The Henderson project tested every skill I'd developed and several I had to learn on the job. Commercial construction is different from residential work, more complex systems, stricter codes, higher stakes. One mistake could cost tens of thousands of dollars or delay the entire project. I worked 16-hour days, 7 days a week. For 8 months straight, I was on site before dawn and stayed until after dark, checking every detail, solving problems, making sure the work met my standards. I lost 15 pounds and developed a permanent squint from reading blueprints in poor light. But it was worth it. The Henderson Plaza was beautiful, clean lines, solid construction, finished ahead of schedule and under budget. More importantly, it proved I could handle large-scale projects. Word spread through the commercial development community, and suddenly, I was getting calls from contractors who'd never heard of me before. The next project was bigger than the one after that. Within 5 years, Thompson Construction had grown from a one-man operation to a company with 12 full-time employees, a fleet of trucks, and a reputation for quality work that commanded premium prices. I bought my first real office during those years, a converted warehouse in the industrial district. It had concrete floors, exposed ceiling beams, and windows that looked out over the rail yard. Not fancy, but functional. I furnished it with steel desks and filing cabinets, a conference table where I could spread out blueprints, and a coffee maker that worked overtime. The business grew methodically. I reinvested profits into better equipment, hired experienced foremen, developed relationships with reliable subcontractors. I started bidding on municipal projects, fire stations, library, renovations, school additions, each job built on the last, creating a portfolio that opened doors to even bigger opportunities. By the time I turned 40, Thompson Construction was one of the most respected commercial builders in the region. We had steady work, loyal employees, and a reputation that generated referrals without advertising. I owned my building, had money in the bank, and could afford to be selective about which projects we took on. I was proud of what I'd built, but it was a quiet pride. There were no graduation ceremonies for successful contractors, no diplomas to hang on the wall. Just steady work, satisfied clients, and the satisfaction of knowing I'd created something lasting. During those years of growth, Claire was still finding herself. She'd moved to the West Coast, working as a freelance graphic designer while pursuing her real art on the side. She sent emails with updates about gallery showings and art fairs, always optimistic about the big break that was just around the corner. Mom and Dad were proud of her persistence, her refusal to give up on her dreams. They worried about her financial situation but admired her artistic integrity. When she called asking for help with rent or emergency car repairs, they found ways to make it work. They never asked about my business unless I brought it up, and when I did, their responses were polite but distant. Construction was blue-collar work, respectable but not particularly impressive. The fact that I'd built a successful company from nothing didn't seem to register as an achievement worth celebrating. Didn't need their validation, or at least I told myself I didn't. I had the satisfaction of work well done, the respect of my peers, and the financial security that came from building something solid. That should have been enough, but sometimes, late at night in my office, looking over job sites and planning schedules. I wondered what it would feel like to have a family that understood what I'd accomplished, to have someone be proud of the empire I'd built, not despite working with my hands, but because of it. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent my entire adult life building things: houses, offices, shopping centers, schools. I'd created structures that would outlast me, that would shelter and serve people for generations. But I'd never been able to build the one thing I wanted most, a family that valued what I had to offer. That would change, but not in the way I expected. The wedding invitation arrived on cream-colored cardstock, embossed with gold lettering that announced the union of my cousin Sarah and her fiancé David. It was the kind of formal invitation that required an RSVP and suggested the event would be significant enough to bring the extended family together for the first time in years. Sarah was Dad's sister's daughter, the cousin who'd always been the responsible one, the one who'd married her college sweetheart and moved to the suburbs to raise 3 kids. Her wedding invitation was a surprise. She'd been divorced for 2 years and had sworn off marriage entirely. Apparently, she'd met someone who'd changed her mind. "It's going to be wonderful," Mom said during our weekly phone call. "Everyone's going to be there. Even Claire is flying in from Portland." That caught my attention. Claire had been living in Portland for 3 years, working as a graphic designer for a small marketing firm while trying to establish herself in the local art scene. She rarely came home for holidays, claiming travel was too expensive or work was too demanding, but she was making the trip for Sarah's wedding. "She's excited to see everyone," Mom continued. "It's been so long since we've all been together." I marked the date on my calendar and made arrangements to close the office early that Friday. A family wedding seemed like a good excuse to take a break from the steady stream of projects that had been keeping me busy. Business was good. Too good I'd been considering hiring another project manager just to keep up with demand. The wedding was held at a country club about an hour's drive from our hometown. I arrived early, partly out of habit, and partly because I wanted to avoid the awkwardness of walking into a room full of relatives I hadn't seen in years. The venue was elegant without being ostentatious: tall windows, hardwood floors, floral arrangements that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. I was nursing a beer at the bar when Claire appeared beside me. She looked good, more sophisticated than I remembered, wearing a dress that probably came from one of those boutiques that don't display price tags. Her hair was shorter, styled in a way that made her look older and more professional. "Marcus," she said, giving me a quick hug, "you look exactly the same." "So do you," I said, though it wasn't entirely true. There was something different about her, a confidence that hadn't been there before. "How's Portland treating you?" "It's amazing," she said, ordering a glass of wine. "The art scene there is incredible. So much creativity, so much support for emerging artists. I have been showing at this gallery in the Pearl District, and there's talk of a solo exhibition next year." I nodded, making the appropriate sounds of interest and encouragement. Claire had been on the verge of breakthrough success. For as long as I'd known her, there was always a gallery show, a potential buyer, a curator who was very interested in her work. "And you?" she asked. "Still building houses? Commercial construction?" "Mostly," I said. "Office buildings, retail spaces, some municipal projects." She looked surprised. "That sounds bigger than I expected." Before I could respond, Mom and Dad appeared, looking slightly overwhelmed by the elegance. Dad was wearing a suit that was probably older than my business, and Mom had chosen a dress that was both too formal and not formal enough for the occasion. "There are my children," Mom said, beaming. Together again, we spent the next hour catching up with relatives I hadn't seen since the last family funeral. There was the usual round of questions about work, relationships, and future plans. Most of the family knew I was in construction, but they had the same vague understanding that Claire had something about building houses, nothing too specific. During dinner, I found myself seated between Claire and our cousin Tom, who worked in insurance and had opinions about everything. The conversation drifted from Sarah's new husband to the state of the economy, to the rising cost of everything. "At least some of us are doing well," Tom said, gesturing toward me with his fork. "Construction's always good business. People always need houses." "Marcus has his own company now," Mom said proudly. "Thompson Construction." "Really?" Claire turned to look at me with what seemed like genuine interest. "How big?" I shrugged. 12 employees. "We stay busy." "That's impressive," she said, and I could hear the surprise in her voice. "I had no idea you'd grown so much." The comment stung, though I tried not to show it. Claire had been so focused on her own struggles and successes that she'd never bothered to ask about mine. To her, I was still the brother who fixed things, who worked with his hands, who didn't require much attention or concern. After dinner, during the dancing portion of the evening, Claire found me on the terrace, overlooking the golf course. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that would have made a beautiful painting. "I owe you an apology," she said, joining me at the railing. "For what?" "For not paying attention. For not asking about your business, your life." I've been so wrapped up in my own stuff that I forgot to be a good sister. I looked at her, trying to read her expression in the fading light. "You don't need to apologize. We've both been busy." "But that's just it," she said. "I've been busy." trying to make it as an artist, and you've been busy actually succeeding, building a real company, employing people, making a difference. That's incredible, Marcus. There was something in her voice that I'd never heard before, respect, maybe even admiration. For a moment, I felt like we were actually connecting, like she was seeing me as more than just the practical brother who'd chosen a different path. Thank you, I said. That means a lot. She smiled, and for the first time in years it felt genuine. We should stay in touch better. I'd love to hear more about what you're doing. I believed her. Looking back, I think she meant it in that moment. But I also think that was the night Claire first realized that her struggling artist brother had become something more than she'd expected, and somewhere in her mind, the seeds of an idea were planted, an idea that would change everything between us. The partnership agreement draft sits in my desk drawer like a coiled snake, 23 pages of legal language that still makes my blood pressure spike when I think about it. Claire's lawyer had presented it with the casual confidence of someone who expected immediate compliance. Sliding it across my conference table like he was offering me a gift, it was a Tuesday morning in October. 3 months after Sarah's wedding, I was reviewing plans for a new medical complex when my assistant Janet buzzed the intercom. Marcus, there's a Claire Thompson here to see you. Says she's your sister. I looked up from the blueprints, confused. Claire had never visited my office, never shown any interest in seeing where I worked. Send her in. Claire appeared in my doorway with a man I didn't recognize, mid-50s, expensive suit, briefcase that probably costs more than most people's monthly salary. He had the particular brand of confidence that comes from billing by the hour and winning most of his cases. Marcus, Claire said, giving me a quick kiss on the cheek. This is Richard Hoffman, my attorney. Attorney. The word hit me like cold water. What's going on, Claire? Hoffman stepped forward, extending his hand. Mr. Thompson, thank you for meeting with us on short notice. I think you'll find our proposal very reasonable. Proposal? Claire settled into one of my conference chairs, crossing her legs and smoothing her skirt. She was wearing another expensive-looking outfit, designer jeans, and a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than my work boots. Marcus, we need to talk about the family business. Family business, I repeated. You mean my business? Thompson Construction, Hoffman said, opening his briefcase and pulling out a folder, which, as we understand it, was built using family resources and support. I stared at him. I'm sorry, what? Claire leaned forward, her expression earnest and slightly wounded. Marcus, you know how much Mom and Dad sacrificed over the years. How much they helped both of us pursue our dreams. The thing is, they put everything into supporting us, and now they're getting older, and their retirement savings are none of your business. I interrupted. Hoffman cleared his throat. Mr. Thompson, perhaps we should review the documentation we've prepared. He slid the folder across the table. We're proposing a partnership arrangement that would formalize the family's investment in Thompson Construction. I opened the folder, scanning the first page. The words swam in front of me. Partnership agreement, 50% ownership interest, immediate vesting, profit sharing. My hands were shaking by the time I reached the signature page. You want half my company? I said quietly. I want what's fair, Claire said. Marcus, think about it. We're family. We should be in this together. Together. I looked up from the papers. Where were you when I was sleeping in my truck? Where were you when I was eating ramen for dinner and working 16-hour days? That's not fair, she said. I was pursuing my own path, building my own career, with Mom and Dad's money they never offered to me. Hoffman intervened smoothly. Mr. Thompson, we're not here to relitigate the past. We're here to discuss a mutually beneficial arrangement that recognizes the family's contribution to your success. I laughed, but there is no humor in it. What contribution? What family investment? Claire's voice took on a wounded tone. The emotional support? The encouragement? The fact that Mom and Dad always believed in you, even when you were struggling, believed in me. I stood up, the chair scraping against the floor. They barely acknowledged what I was doing. Every conversation was about your art, your shows, your next degree. That's not true. It absolutely is true. I was raising my voice now, something I rarely did. You got $40,000 for art school, another $40,000 for your master's degree, money for your studio, money for your business, money every time you called with an emergency. What did I get? Hoffman maintained his professional calm. Mr. Thompson, the specific amounts of family assistance aren't really the issue here. The issue is establishing a fair partnership that benefits everyone. I looked at the partnership agreement again, focusing on the details I'd missed in my first shocked reading. According to this document, Claire would receive 50% ownership of Thompson Construction in exchange for nothing. No financial investment, no work contribution, no expertise. Just the fact that we shared DNA. This is insane, I said. You want me to give you half of everything I've built because we're related? Because family shares everything, Claire said, and there was steel in her voice now. Because that's what families do. They support each other. The way you supported me. She flinched. I couldn't help you financially. I was struggling to, but you never struggled alone. You always had Mom and Dad to bail you out. You always had a safety net. Hoffman checked his watch. Perhaps we should give you some time to review the documents. Discuss this with your own attorney. But I should mention that we're hoping to resolve this amicably within the family. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Resolve this amicably, or we'll make it public. We'll drag this through court. Expose your business to scrutiny. Make your life complicated in ways that could damage everything you've built. Get out, I said quietly. Marcus, Claire started. Get out of my office, both of you. Claire stood. Slowly, her expression hurt and angry. I thought you'd be reasonable about this. I thought you'd want to do right by the family. I have done right by the family. I've taken care of myself, built something solid, never asked for anything from anyone. That's not enough for you. It's not about enough, she said. It's about fairness. It's about recognizing that we're in this together. After they left, I sat in my office for an hour, staring at the partnership agreement. 23 pages of legal language that boiled down to a simple demand. Give me half of everything because I say you should. The document was professionally prepared, carefully worded, designed to sound reasonable while demanding the unreasonable. It talked about family unity and shared prosperity and equitable distribution of resources. It made Claire sound like a victim of inequality rather than what she actually was, a woman who'd spent her entire adult life being subsidized by her parents while her brother built something from nothing. I called my attorney that afternoon. Jake Morrison had handled all my business legal work for 5 years. A straightforward guy who specialized in construction law and didn't waste time on pleasantries. Jake, I need to see you. Today, if possible. Everything okay? I looked at the partnership agreement again. No, everything is definitely not okay. The private investigator's report arrived in a manila envelope marked confidential in red letters. I'd hired Rebecca Chen 3 weeks after Claire's visit, on Jake Morrison's recommendation. If you're going to fight this, Jake had said, you need to know what you're fighting against. Rebecca specialized in financial investigations, the kind of thorough background checks that revealed the truth behind public facades. Her report was 47 pages of meticulously documented information that painted a picture I'd suspected but never confirmed. Claire was broke. Not just temporarily short on cash, but genuinely, catastrophically broke. I read the report in my office after hours, when the building was quiet and I could focus without interruption. The numbers were worse than I'd imagined. Credit card debt, totaling $67,000. 2 personal loans in default. A business line of credit that had been called due after missed payments. Her Portland apartment was 3 months behind on rent, and her landlord had filed for eviction. But the most damning information was in the section labeled Business Ventures and Financial History. Rebecca had traced Claire's financial decisions over the past decade, documenting a pattern of poor judgment and unrealistic expectations. The ceramic business, I remembered, had actually been 3 separate business attempts. The first had failed within 6 months when Claire discovered that hand-painting custom dinnerware wasn't as profitable as she'd hoped. The second had collapsed when her business partner embezzled money and disappeared. The third had limped along for 2 years before dying a slow death of mounting debt and dwindling orders. Between business attempts, Claire had tried freelance graphic design, art instruction, even a brief stint selling handmade jewelry at craft fairs. Each venture had started with optimism and ended with debt. Each failure had been followed by another loan from mom and dad, another rescue from financial catastrophe. The report documented 17 separate financial bailouts over 8 years. 17 times Claire had called home with an emergency, and 17 times my parents had found money they didn't have to solve her problems. The total amount was staggering over $80,000 in direct loans and gifts, plus uncounted thousands in indirect support like paid vacations, groceries, and emergency visits home that lasted for months. Rebecca had also investigated Claire's current living situation in Portland, the expensive clothes, the designer apartment, the sophisticated lifestyle I'd witnessed at Sarah's wedding. All of it was financed through credit cards and loans. Claire was living like a successful artist while accumulating debt at an alarming rate. The gambling information was buried in the middle of the report, a section that made my stomach turn. Rebecca had found evidence of regular casino visits, online poker accounts, and what appeared to be a serious betting problem. Claire wasn't just bad with money. She was actively destroying her financial future through compulsive gambling. Bank records showed ATM withdrawals from casino locations, often multiple times per week. Credit card statements revealed cash advances taken at gambling establishments. There were online gambling sites, sports betting accounts, even evidence of borrowing money from illegal loan sources. The pattern was clear. Claire would get money from my parents, use it to pay immediate debts, then gamble away whatever was left. When the next crisis hit, she'd call home again, always with a reasonable explanation that hid the underlying addiction. I thought about all the conversations over the years, all the stories about slow-paying clients and unexpected expenses and temporary setbacks. None of it had been true. Claire hadn't been struggling to build a career, she'd been struggling to feed an addiction that was consuming everything she touched. The report also revealed something that made Claire's current demand even more obscene. She'd been researching my business for months before showing up in my office. Rebecca found evidence of online searches about Thompson Construction, inquiries to trade organizations about commercial construction companies, even a credit report. Requests that had been filed under false pretenses. Claire hadn't suddenly realized I was successful at Sarah's wedding. She'd been investigating my financial situation, calculating how much money I might have, planning her approach. The surprise and admiration she'd shown that night had been an act, preparation for what she'd always intended to do. The final section of the report contained information about Richard Hoffman, Claire's attorney. He was legitimate, but his specialty was questionable financial arrangements and asset recovery cases. He'd represented clients in fraudulent investment schemes, inheritance disputes, and what the report diplomatically called aggressive family financial negotiations. In other words, Hoffman was the kind of lawyer you hired when you wanted to take money from people who probably didn't owe it to you. I closed the report and sat in the dark for a long time, processing what I'd learned. My sister wasn't just entitled or misguided, she was desperate. The gambling addiction explained everything. The constant financial crises, the inability to maintain any business venture, the willingness to demand half of my company, despite contributing nothing to it. Claire was drowning in debt and addiction, and she saw my success as her lifeline. She wasn't asking for help, she was trying to take what I'd built and use it to fund her self-destruction. The cruelest part was how she'd framed her demand. Family shares everything. It's about fairness. We're in this together. She'd wrap her greed in the language of family obligation, making me feel guilty for protecting what I'd earned through honest work. But I wasn't guilty. I was angry. I'd spent 22 years building Thompson Construction, working 16-hour days, sleeping in my truck, eating ramen for dinner, reinvesting every profit into better equipment and more employees. I'd created jobs, built lasting structures, earned every dollar through skill and persistence. Claire had spent those same years chasing fantasies, accumulating debt, and gambling away every opportunity she'd been given. She'd had advantages I'd never enjoyed: financial support, family encouragement, multiple chances to succeed. She'd squandered all of it. Now she wanted to claim half of what I'd built. Not because she'd earned it, but because she was desperate enough to try stealing it. I picked up the phone and called Jake Morrison's emergency line. Jake, it's Marcus. I just finished reading the investigator's report. And we're going to fight this. Whatever it takes. Mom's handwritten letter arrived on a Saturday, delivered with the regular mail in her familiar cursive script. The return address was unnecessary. I recognized her handwriting from birthday cards and grocery lists. The careful loops and careful spacing of someone who'd learned penmanship in a different era. I almost didn't open it. Since Claire's visit to my office 2 weeks earlier, my parents had been calling daily, leaving increasingly frustrated voicemails that I'd been avoiding. I knew what they wanted to discuss, and I wasn't ready for that conversation. But something about the formality of a written letter made me pause. Mom rarely wrote letters anymore, preferring phone calls or the occasional email. This felt important, deliberate, like something she'd thought about carefully before committing to paper. I opened it while standing in my kitchen. Coffee growing cold in my hand. Dear Marcus, it began. Your father and I are very disappointed in how you're handling this situation with Claire. We raised you both to care for each other, to be there when family needs help. Claire is struggling, and instead of supporting her, you're being selfish and stubborn. The words hit harder than I'd expected. Selfish, stubborn. Not the qualities I associated with myself, not the way I'd thought my parents saw me. Claire told us about her business proposal. The letter continued, it sounds very reasonable to us. She's not asking for charity, she's asking to be partners with her brother, to work together to build something bigger than either of you could manage alone. Isn't that what family is supposed to do? I sat down at my kitchen table, reading more. Slowly, Mom's version of events bore no resemblance to what had actually happened in my office. According to her letter, Claire had presented a business proposal for partnership and collaboration. There was no mention of the demand for 50% ownership, no acknowledgement that Claire was asking for half of everything I'd built without contributing anything in return. Your father and I have always been proud of both our children, the letter went on. Claire for her artistic talents and her determination to follow her dreams, and you for your hard work and business success. But success means nothing if you don't share it with the people who matter most. The guilt was expertly applied, layered with the kind of emotional manipulation that only comes from decades of practice. Mom had always been skilled at making me feel responsible for other people's happiness, particularly Claire's. When we were children, it was my job to include Claire in my games, to share my toys, to make sure she didn't feel left out. Now, apparently, it was my job to share my business. Claire is your only sister, the letter continued. She's family. Family doesn't abandon each other when times get hard. We didn't abandon you when you were starting your business, even though we couldn't help financially. We supported you in other ways, with encouragement, with belief in your abilities, with love. I almost laughed at that revision of history. The support I'd received had been polite disinterest at best. They'd never asked about my business. unless I brought it up first, never showed curiosity about my projects or my struggles. When I'd been sleeping in my truck and eating ramen for dinner, they'd been sending money to Claire for art supplies and studio rent. But according to Mom's letter, their neglect had been a form of support. Their indifference had been encouragement. Their focus on Claire had been balanced attention to both children. We're asking you to reconsider, the letter concluded, not just for Claire's sake, but for the sake of our family. Do the right thing, Marcus. Be the son we raised you to be. I set the letter down and stared out my kitchen window at the backyard I'd landscaped myself, thinking about the phrase, the son we raised you to be. Who was that son? Exactly. The one who worked without complaint, who never asked for help, who solved his own problems and stayed out of the way while the family focused on Claire's needs. Or was it the son who was supposed to sacrifice his own success to bail out his sister's poor decisions? The son who should feel guilty for achieving what she couldn't, responsible for fixing what she'd broken? The phone rang while I was still holding the letter. Dad's name appeared on the caller ID, and after a moment's hesitation, I answered. Marcus's voice was tired, strained. We need to talk. I got Mom's letter. Then you know how we feel about this situation. I know how Claire described the situation to you, I said. But that's not what actually happened. There was a pause. What do you mean? I took a deep breath. Dad, Claire didn't present a business proposal. She demanded half my company, 50% ownership, immediately, for nothing. No investment, no work, no contribution. Just because we're related. That's not, he stopped. She said it was a partnership arrangement. A partnership where I do all the work and she gets half the profits? Would you call that fair? Another pause, longer this time. Marcus, she's your sister, and I'm her brother. Doesn't that count for anything? Doesn't the fact that I built this company from nothing mean anything? Of course it does. We're proud of what you've accomplished. But Claire is struggling, and Claire is always struggling, Dad. She's been struggling for 20 years, and every time she calls, you and Mom find money to solve her problems. How much have you given her over the years? Silence. How much, Dad? That's not the point. It absolutely is the point. You've subsidized Claire's lifestyle for her entire adult life while I've taken care of myself. And now she wants me to subsidize it too. She's family, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. So am I. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen for an hour, reading Mom's letter again, and thinking about family loyalty. They wanted me to share my success with Claire, to treat her like an equal partner in something she'd never contributed to. They framed it as generosity, as family obligation, as the right thing to do. But what about Claire's obligation to me? What about her responsibility to contribute something before demanding half of everything? What about fairness that worked both ways? I thought about the investigator's report, about Claire's gambling addiction and mounting debts. My parents didn't know about any of that. They saw their daughter struggling with her art career, not understanding that the struggle was self-inflicted, that every dollar they'd given her had probably ended up in a casino or online betting site. I gave Claire half my company. She wouldn't use it to become a productive partner. She'd use it to fund her addiction until there was nothing left. Thompson Construction would become another casualty of her compulsive gambling, another business destroyed by her inability to make responsible decisions. But I couldn't tell my parents that without revealing how much I'd learned about Claire's private life, and even if I did, would they believe me? Or would they find ways to excuse her behavior, to blame external circumstances for her choices? I folded Mom's letter and put it in my desk drawer, next to Claire's partnership agreement. 2 documents that represented 2 different versions of reality. One where I was the selfish son who wouldn't help his struggling sister, and one where I was the successful businessman being targeted for exploitation. The truth was probably somewhere in between, but it was closer to the second version than the first. I wasn't going to give Claire half my company, not to preserve family harmony, not to fulfill some imaginary obligation, not to make my parents happy. I'd worked too hard and sacrificed too much to hand over half of everything to someone who'd never earned it. If that made me selfish, so be it. Sometimes selfishness was just another word for self-respect. The retainer agreement with Morrison & Associates was straightforward: $10,000 up front, $300 per hour for Jake's time, with the understanding that family litigation could get expensive quickly. I signed it without hesitation, viewing it as an investment in protecting everything I'd built. Jake Morrison's office reflected his no-nonsense approach to law: functional furniture, law books that looked actually used, and a desk covered with active case files rather than decorative objects. He'd been handling my business legal work for 5 years, everything from contract reviews to employment issues, and I trusted his judgment. Let me make sure I understand this correctly, Jake said, reviewing the partnership agreement Claire's lawyer had presented. Your sister wants 50% ownership of Thompson Construction, with immediate vesting. In exchange for, he flipped through the pages. Nothing. No financial investment, no expertise, no work contribution, just family relationship. That's it. And she's never been involved in the business. Never provided any assistance, financial or otherwise. Never. She's never even visited my office before last month. Jake leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against the desk. Marcus, I've seen a lot of frivolous lawsuits in 20 years of practice, but this might be the most baseless claim I've encountered. There's no legal theory that would support this demand, so we can just ignore it. We could, but that might not be the smartest approach. Hoffman is a competent attorney, even if his client's case is garbage. He knows this won't hold up in court, which means he's probably planning to make this as expensive and unpleasant as possible. Hoping you'll settle just to make it go away. I thought about Claire's financial situation, the gambling debts, the desperation that had driven her to my office. She doesn't have money for a long legal fight. She doesn't need money up front. If Hoffman is working on contingency, he takes the case for free, and if they win, he gets a percentage of the settlement. If they lose, he gets nothing. It's a low-risk strategy from their perspective. Jake pulled out a legal pad and started making notes. The good news is that we have a strong defense. You've never accepted family money for the business, never promised anyone ownership shares, never created any legal obligations to share profits. Thompson Construction is a sole proprietorship. You own it completely. What about their argument that family should share everything? That's not a legal argument, it's an emotional appeal. Courts don't divide assets based on family sentiment. They follow contract law, property law, and established precedent. There's no precedent for forcing someone to share a business they built independently just because they're related to the person making the demand. Jake's confidence was reassuring, but I could see the concern in his expression. The challenge isn't the legal merits, it's the emotional and financial cost of fighting this. Even a frivolous lawsuit can be expensive to defend, and family litigation gets ugly fast. How ugly? They'll subpoena your business records, your personal financial information, everything. They'll depose your employees, your clients, anyone who might have information about how you built the company. They'll look for any evidence that you received family help, even indirectly. I thought about the investigator's report on Claire's gambling addiction. What if we can prove she's financially irresponsible? That giving her ownership would be harmful to the business. That's potentially useful, but it's also dangerous. If we attack her character, they'll attack yours. They'll argue that you're being vindictive, that you're using her personal struggles against her. Family court judges don't like sibling warfare. Jake continued taking notes. Our best strategy is to focus on the legal facts. You built this business independently, using your own resources and labor. You never accepted family investment or promised anyone ownership. The company's success is the result of your individual effort and skill. What about the emotional support argument? Mom and Dad are saying they supported me in other ways. Emotional support doesn't create legal ownership. If it did, every successful person would owe equity to everyone who ever encouraged them. Teachers, friends, mentors, they all provide support, but that doesn't give them ownership rights. Jake set down his pen and looked at me directly. Marcus, I need to ask you something important, and I need a completely honest answer. Is there any truth to Claire's claims? Any family money that went into the business? Any promises you made? Any reason she might legitimately expect a share in your success? I thought about the question carefully. There had been moments over the years when my parents had helped in small ways. Mom, occasionally bringing me lunch on job sites. Dad lending me tools when my equipment broke down. But nothing that could be considered a business investment. No, I said, there's no legitimate basis for her claim. Then we fight it. But you need to understand what you're signing up for. This will probably take a year to resolve, maybe longer. It will cost money, probably more than the retainer. And it will be emotionally draining, especially since it involves your family. I thought about Mom's letter, about the disappointment in my parents' voices, about the way this lawsuit would divide the family permanently. Claire and I might never speak again. My parents might never forgive me for fighting their favorite daughter in court, but the alternative was worse. Giving Claire half of Thompson Construction wouldn't solve her problems. It would just give her more money to gamble away while destroying the business I'd spent 22 years building. My employees would lose their jobs. My clients would lose confidence. Everything I'd worked for would be sacrificed to fund my sister's addiction. I'm signing up, I said. Whatever it costs, whatever it takes. Jake nodded. Then let's start building our defense. I'll need complete financial records for Thompson Construction from the beginning, tax returns, bank statements, loan documents, everything. I'll also need documentation of your personal finances, particularly during the early years when you were getting started. I kept everything. Good. We'll also need witness statements from people who knew you during the startup years. Employees, clients, suppliers, anyone who can testify about how you built the business. I thought about the early days, the contractors who'd given me my first breaks, the suppliers who'd extended credit when I had no track record. Most of them were still in business, still part of my professional network. I can provide that. One more thing, Jake said. Don't talk to your family about this case. Don't discuss strategy. Don't share information about our defense. Don't let them pressure you into settling. Everything you say to them could potentially be used against you. That hit harder than I'd expected. Fighting Claire in court was one thing, but cutting off communication with my parents felt like crossing a line I couldn't uncross. They're going to want to talk about it. Tell them to contact me directly. All communication about this case goes through attorneys from now on. It's the only way to protect yourself. As I left Jake's office, I felt the weight of what I'd committed to. I wasn't just fighting for my business, I was fighting for the principle that success earned through honest work couldn't be taken away by family members who felt entitled to it. The battle was just beginning, but I was ready for it. The bank statements arrived in 3 large boxes, delivered by Rebecca Chin's assistant on a gray November morning. 5 years of Claire's financial records, obtained through methods I preferred not to think about too deeply. What mattered was that they were legitimate, admissible in court, and devastating to any claim that Claire was a responsible person who deserved to manage half of my business. I spread the statements across my conference table, organizing them. Chronologically, the pattern was immediately obvious, even to someone without a background in financial analysis. Claire's spending followed the classic trajectory of a gambling addict. Periods of relative stability punctuated by sudden, massive withdrawals and increasingly desperate attempts to cover losses. The early statements, from 5 years ago, showed a somewhat normal financial life. Regular deposits from freelance design work, modest withdrawals for rent and groceries, occasional splurges on art supplies or clothing. But even then, there were warning signs: cash advances from credit cards, overdraft fees, mysterious transfers to accounts I didn't recognize. By the 3rd year, the pattern had accelerated. Claire's legitimate income remained steady, but her expenses had exploded. The bank statements showed dozens of ATM withdrawals from casino locations, often multiple times per week. $500 here, $800 there, sometimes more than $1,000 in a single day. But it was the online activity that truly revealed the scope of her addiction. Rebecca had traced electronic transfers to gambling websites, sports, betting platforms, and what appeared to be illegal offshore poker sites. The amounts were staggering: $20,000 in 1 month alone. All of it borrowed against credit cards and lines of credit. The most disturbing discovery was a pattern of timing that correlated perfectly with my parents' financial support. Every time Claire received money from home documented in bank records as deposits, labeled family loan or gift from parents, the gambling activity would spike dramatically within days. One particularly damning sequence showed a deposit from my parents on a Tuesday, followed by a $4,000-$8,100 transfer to an online casino on Wednesday. Claire had literally gambled away 96% of my parents' loan within 24 hours of receiving it. I called Rebecca with questions about some of the more unusual transactions. "This account here," I said, pointing to a series of transfers. "What is this?" "Loan shark," she said without hesitation. Claire borrowed money from non-bank lenders when the legitimate sources dried up. The interest rates are predatory, usually 30 to 40% annually, sometimes much higher. How much does she owe? Based on what I could trace, at least $20,000 to various illegal lenders. Probably more that I couldn't document. The implications were terrifying. Claire wasn't just financially irresponsible, she was involved with dangerous people, the kind who didn't accept bankruptcy or family problems as excuses for not. Her demand for half my company wasn't just greed, it was desperation, driven by fear. Rebecca had also investigated Claire's recent art career, the professional life she'd presented to the family as legitimate and promising. The reality was very different from the success story she'd been telling. The gallery showings she mentioned, Rebecca said, most of them were group exhibitions where anyone could participate for a fee. Pay-to-play arrangements, not real recognition of artistic merit. The solo exhibition she talked about was at a coffee shop, not a legitimate gallery. What about her freelance design work? Inconsistent at best. She's had 3 regular clients in the past 2 years, but she's lost 2 of them due to missed deadlines and quality issues. Her current income is about $1,500 per month, nowhere near enough to cover her expenses. The financial records painted a picture of someone in complete denial about reality. Claire was spending money she didn't have on gambling she couldn't afford, while maintaining an expensive lifestyle that required constant borrowing. Her monthly expenses exceeded her income by a factor of 3, a gap she filled through credit cards, family loans, and increasingly dangerous private lending. But perhaps the most revealing document was a series of internet searches Rebecca had recovered from Claire's computer, starting 6 months before her visit to my office. Claire had been researching Thompson construction extensively. She'd looked up business valuation methods, partnership law, inheritance rights, and something that made my blood run cold: how to claim ownership of family business. Claire's demand hadn't been a spontaneous decision driven by temporary financial pressure. It had been a calculated plan, researched and prepared over months. She'd been studying my business, looking for legal angles, planning her approach. The surprise and admiration she'd shown at Sarah's wedding had been completely fake. She'd already known about my success, and was planning to claim half of it. Even more disturbing was evidence that she'd been discussing the plan with other people. Rebecca found email exchanges with friends where Claire referred to getting what I deserved from my brother's company, and finally making Marcus share the wealth. She'd been building support for her position, creating a narrative where she was the victim of family inequality rather than the author of her own financial destruction. The emails revealed Claire's mindset with brutal clarity. She genuinely believed she was entitled to half of everything I'd built, not because she'd contributed to it, but because life had been unfair to her. My success was somehow proof of her victimization, evidence that the family had favored me over her. In reality, the opposite was true. Claire had received every advantage: financial support, emotional encouragement, multiple chances to succeed. She'd squandered all of it through poor decisions and compulsive gambling, then convinced herself that her failures were somehow my fault. The final piece of evidence was perhaps the most damning. A loan application Claire had submitted to a bank 3 weeks before visiting my office. She'd listed Thompson Construction as a family business and claimed to own a 25% stake in the company. When the bank had requested documentation of her ownership, she'd been unable to provide it, and the loan had been denied. But the application showed her thought process. She'd been planning to claim partial ownership of my business as collateral for borrowing even more money. If I'd agreed to her partnership demand, she would have immediately leveraged that ownership to obtain new loans, using my company's assets. To secure money she'd inevitably gamble away. I sat back in my chair, overwhelmed by the scope of Claire's deception and self-destruction. This wasn't just a greedy sister trying to claim unearned wealth. This was a woman whose addiction had completely corrupted her judgment and moral compass. She was willing to destroy my business, my livelihood, and our family relationships to feed a gambling habit that would ultimately consume whatever resources she could access. The bank statements and financial records would be devastating evidence in court, but they also made me profoundly sad. This was my sister, the little girl who used to paint watercolors at the kitchen table while I fixed broken appliances. Somewhere along the way, she'd lost herself completely, trading her artistic dreams for the hollow promise of gambling winnings that would never come. But sadness couldn't change the facts. Claire was dangerous not just to herself, but to anyone foolish enough to give her access to money or assets. Giving her half of Thompson Construction wouldn't help her recover from her addiction. It would just provide more fuel for her self-destruction. While taking down everything I'd built in the process, I called Jake Morrison to schedule a meeting. The evidence was overwhelming, the defense was clear, and I was ready to fight as hard as necessary to protect what I'd earned. Claire had made her choice years ago, when she'd chosen gambling over responsibility, addiction over honesty, entitlement over effort. Now I was making mine. The mediation notice arrived on letterhead from the county courthouse, scheduling a mandatory settlement conference for January 15th. By then, Claire had officially filed her lawsuit, claiming unjust enrichment and demanding not just 50% ownership, but retroactive profit sharing for the past 5 years. Her greed had apparently grown with her desperation. Jake Morrison had warned me this would happen. Mediation is required in family disputes, he'd explained. The court wants to give families a chance to resolve things privately before putting everything on public record. I wasn't optimistic about mediation succeeding, but I was curious to see how Claire would present her case to a neutral third party. Would she acknowledge the weakness of her legal position, or had she convinced herself that her demands were reasonable? The mediation was held in a sterile conference room at the courthouse, presided over by retired Judge Patricia Wells. Claire arrived with Richard Hoffman and a second attorney I didn't recognize. Apparently, they'd decided this case warranted additional legal firepower. Claire looked different than she had in my office 3 months earlier. The expensive clothes were gone, replaced by a conservative business suit that looked borrowed or purchased secondhand. She'd lost weight, and there were dark circles under her eyes that suggested she wasn't sleeping well. The pressure of the lawsuit, or more likely the pressure from her creditors, was clearly taking its toll. Judge Wells opened the session by explaining the mediation process and encouraging both sides to approach the discussion with open minds and realistic expectations. Then she invited Claire's team to present their position. Hoffman spoke first, outlining what he called the family investment theory. According to this narrative, Thompson Construction had benefited from years of family support, emotional encouragement, professional advice from my father's experience in manufacturing, even indirect financial assistance through family gatherings that had provided networking opportunities. It was creative fiction, the kind of legal storytelling that takes tiny grains of truth and spins them into elaborate justifications. Yes, my father had occasionally offered advice about dealing with suppliers and managing workers. Yes, family gatherings had sometimes led to conversations with potential clients. But transforming these minor interactions into a basis for 50% ownership required a level of imagination that bordered on fantasy. Claire spoke next, and her presentation was even more divorced from reality. She talked about shared family dreams and collaborative vision and the understanding that we would build something together. She described conversations that had never happened, agreements that had never been made, promises that existed only in her increasingly desperate imagination. Most disturbing was her characterization of my success as somehow illegitimate. According to Claire, I'd had unfair advantages being male in a male-dominated industry, having natural mechanical abilities that made construction work easier for me. benefiting from societal expectations that favored my career path over hers. Marcus always had it easier, she said, looking directly at Judge Wells. Society supports men who work in construction. No one questions their choices or expects them to justify their career decisions. I've had to fight for every opportunity, overcome discrimination and skepticism about women in the arts. I listened to this revisionist history with growing anger. Claire had spent her entire adult life being subsidized by our parents, while I'd supported myself from day one. She'd been encouraged to pursue her artistic dreams regardless of financial practicality, while I'd been expected to be The idea that I'd had unfair advantages was so backwards, it would have been laughable if it weren't being presented as the basis for stealing half my company. When it was my turn to respond, I focused on facts rather than emotions. I presented documentation of Thompson Construction's development, the business registration, early tax returns, equipment purchases, employee records. Every document told the same story. I had built this company independently, using my own resources and labor, without any significant family investment. Jake followed with a devastating presentation of Claire's financial history. He didn't mention the gambling addiction. Specifically, that would come later if we went to trial, but he showed the pattern of financial irresponsibility. The multiple failed businesses, the constant requests for family bailouts. Your Honor, Jake said, the plaintiff is asking for ownership in a successful business that she's never contributed to, never worked for, and never invested in. This isn't about family collaboration. It's about financial desperation driving unreasonable demands. Judge Wells asked pointed questions about Claire's claims. Had there ever been a written agreement about partnership? No. Had she ever worked for Thompson Construction? No. Had she ever invested money in the business? No. Had Marcus ever promised her ownership? No. The weakness of Claire's position was obvious, but Hoffman gamely tried to reframe the discussion. This wasn't about legal technicalities, he argued. It was about moral obligations and family values. Marcus had a duty to share his success with his struggling sister, regardless of legal requirements. That's not how the law works, Judge Wells said dryly. Moral obligations don't create ownership rights. After 3 hours of increasingly strained discussion, Judge Wells called for a private conference with the attorneys. Claire and I were left alone in the conference room, the first time we'd been in the same space without lawyers present since this nightmare began. Marcus, she said quietly, this doesn't have to go to court. We can still work something out. I looked at my sister, really looked at her. The desperation was obvious now. The fear barely contained behind her composed facade. She was drowning and trying to drag me down with her. What would you consider reasonable? I asked. 25%, she said immediately, and maybe some help with my current debts, just to get me back on my feet. Even in mediation, even after having her claims thoroughly demolished by facts and logic, she was still trying to take a quarter of everything I'd built, and she wanted me to pay off her gambling debts as well. Claire, I said, I'm not giving you any percentage of my company, and I'm not paying your debts. Her composure cracked. You can afford it. You could write a check right now and not even notice the money. That's not the point. Then what is the point? Punishing me for not being as successful as you. The point is that you didn't earn it. The point is that giving you money won't solve your problems, it will just enable you to make them worse. She stared at me with a mixture of hurt and anger. You've changed, Marcus. You used to care about family. I still care about family, but I won't let family destroy what I've built. When the attorneys returned, Judge Wells announced that mediation had failed. This case will proceed to trial, she said. I strongly encourage both parties to reconsider their positions before that happens. Litigation is expensive, time-consuming, and emotionally destructive, especially in family disputes. As we left the courthouse, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. Relief that we were moving toward a resolution, even if it meant going to trial. Sadness that my relationship with Claire was probably beyond repair. Jake walked me to my truck, reviewing what would happen next. Discovery phase starts now, he said. They'll subpoena all your business records, and we'll do the same with Claire's finances. Everything comes out in the open. Good, I said. I want everything in the open, Marcus. Once we start formal discovery, there's no going back. This becomes a public court case, permanently on record. Your family relationships will never be the same. I thought about Mom's disappointed letter, about Dad's tired voice on the phone, about the way this lawsuit had already divided the family into camps. Going to trial would make the division permanent and public, but the alternative was surrendering to extortion, rewarding Claire's financial irresponsibility, and potentially destroying my business to fund her gambling addiction. Let's proceed, I said. Whatever it takes. The court docket listed our case as Thompson v. Thompson, reducing years of family history and a lifetime of complex relationships to a simple legal dispute between siblings. I sat at the defendant's table on a cold February morning, watching potential jurors file into the courtroom and wondering what they would make of this mess. Judge Harold Martinez presided, a no-nonsense veteran of family court who'd seen every variation of greed, entitlement, and family dysfunction. He reviewed the case file with visible skepticism, occasionally glancing at Claire. and her legal team with the expression of someone who'd heard these arguments before. Jury selection took most of the morning. Hoffman tried to seat jurors who might be sympathetic to an underdog sister fighting her successful brother. Jake focused on finding people who understood business and wouldn't be swayed by emotional manipulation. In the end, we got a mixed group: small business owners, retirees, a teacher, an accountant, to construction workers who knew the industry. Claire sat at the plaintiff's table wearing the same conservative suit from mediation, but she'd added a touch that made me want to laugh if the situation weren't so serious as a small silver cross necklace that hadn't been there before. Apparently, her legal team thought religious symbolism might help her case. My parents were in the gallery, sitting in the front row behind Claire's table. Mom looked older than I remembered, worn down by months of family conflict. Dad stared straight ahead, his expression carefully neutral. They've chosen their side, but I could see the toll this was taking on them. Hoffman's opening statement was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation, disguised as legal argument. He painted a picture of two siblings raised in a loving family that emphasized sharing and mutual support. Marcus, he said, had been the beneficiary of this family culture, receiving encouragement and assistance that had enabled his business success. Now, when his sister needed help, he was selfishly refusing to honor the family values that had made his achievements possible. This isn't about legal technicalities, Hoffman told the jury. This is about a family that taught their children to care for each other, and a successful brother who has forgotten those lessons. He was careful to avoid making specific claims about financial investment or formal agreements. The evidence was too clear on those points. Instead, he focused on emotional and moral arguments, trying to make the jury feel that I owed Claire something regardless of legal requirements. Jake's opening was facts only, delivered in his characteristic straightforward style. He outlined the timeline of Thompson Construction's development, emphasizing that every major decision, every investment, every risk had been mine alone. He showed charts comparing Claire's financial support from our parents with the $0 I'd received for business purposes. The plaintiff is asking this jury to award her 50% ownership of a business she's never worked for, never invested in, and never contributed to, Jake said. She's asking you to ignore property law, contract law, and basic fairness because she happens to be related to the defendant. The first witness was Claire herself. Hoffman had coached her. While she was composed, articulate, and convincing, you didn't know the underlying facts. She talked about our childhood, about family dinners where business was discussed, about the understanding that we would always support each other. Marcus and I grew up in a family that shared everything. She testified, when one of us succeeded, we all succeeded. When one of us struggled, we all helped. That was just how our family worked. She described conversations that I barely remembered, interpreting casual comments as serious business discussions. A joke I'd made about needing a business partner became evidence of my intention to include her. Dad's advice about dealing with difficult clients became proof of family investment in my success. Most damaging was her characterization of my personality and motivations. According to Claire, I'd always been secretive about money, competitive with my siblings, resentful of the attention she received for her artistic talents. She painted me as someone who'd deliberately excluded her from business opportunities. Out of spite and jealousy, Marcus has always needed to be the successful one, she said, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. He couldn't stand that our parents were proud of my art, so he made sure I could never be part of his business world. It was skillfully done, mixing enough truth with enough fiction to create a plausible narrative. Yes, I'd been competitive. As a child, yes, I'd sometimes resented the attention Claire received, but transforming normal sibling rivalry into evidence of systematic exclusion required a level of creative interpretation that belonged in fiction, not a courtroom. Jake's cross-examination was surgical. He started with simple questions about Claire's work history, her financial situation, her involvement in Thompson Construction. Each answer revealed the weakness of her position. Ms. Thompson, have you ever worked for Thompson Construction? No. But have you ever invested money in Thompson Construction? Not directly, but the family. Yes or no? Have you personally invested money in Thompson Construction? No. Have you ever received salary, wages, or any other compensation from Thompson Construction? No. Have you ever attended a business meeting, reviewed financial records, or participated in any business decisions for Thompson Construction? No. But that's because Marcus excluded me. Ms. Thompson, please answer the question. Have you ever participated in any business decisions for Thompson Construction? No. Jake continued methodically, establishing that Claire had no legitimate basis for claiming ownership in a business she'd never been involved with. Her answers became increasingly defensive, her explanations more elaborate and less convincing. The most devastating moment came when Jake asked about her financial requests over the years. Ms. Thompson, how many times have you asked your parents for financial assistance in the past 10 years? Claire hesitated. I don't know exactly. Would you say more than 5 times? Probably. More than 10 times? Maybe. More than 15 times. She was quiet for a long moment. I don't keep track of things like that. We do, Jake said. producing a chart that documented every loan and gift Claire had received from our parents. According to bank records, you've received financial assistance from your parents 23 times in the past 10 years, totaling $87,000. Is that accurate? Claire stared at the chart, her composed facade finally cracking. Those were loans, she said weakly. How much of that money have you repaid? Silence. Ms. Thompson, how much of the $87,000 have you repaid to your parents? I'm working on a payment plan. How much have you repaid? None of it yet, but none. Thank you. By the time Jake finished with Claire, her credibility was in ruins. The jury had heard her acknowledge that she'd never contributed to my business, while receiving nearly $100,000 in family support that she'd never repaid. Her moral authority to demand half of my success had evaporated. Hoffman tried to rehabilitate her during redirect, but the damage was done. Claire's testimony had revealed the truth about our family dynamics. She was the one who'd received preferential treatment, not me. She was the one who'd been subsidized and supported, not me. Her claim of unfair treatment was the opposite of reality. As court adjourned for the day, I caught my parents' eyes in the gallery. Dad looked stunned, probably hearing for the first time the full scope of Claire's financial dependence. Mom was crying quietly, whether from embarrassment or sadness, I couldn't tell. The trial was just beginning, but the foundation of Claire's case had already crumbled. Tomorrow, we would start presenting the defense, and the jury would hear the real story of how Thompson Construction was built, the financial records that sealed Claire's fate were spread across 3 tables in the courtroom. A paper trail of my business journey that told the story more clearly than any testimony could. Jake had organized 22 years of documentation into a timeline that showed exactly how Thompson Construction had been built, dollar by dollar, decision by decision, entirely through my own efforts. I took the witness stand on the second day of trial, acutely aware that this was my chance to tell the truth about what I'd accomplished and how I'd accomplished it. Jake led me through my testimony methodically, starting with my early years in construction and the decision to start my own company. Mr. Thompson, when you started your business, did you receive any financial investment from family members? No. I started with my own savings, about $800. Did your parents offer to invest in your business? No. They were helping Claire with art school at the time. All their available money was going toward her education. We walked through the early years, the jobs I'd taken to survive, the equipment I'd bought secondhand, the gradual building of reputation and client base. I showed the jury my first business license, my first tax return showing a profit of $3,000, my first equipment loan that I'd secured using my truck as collateral. During this startup period, did you live with your parents or receive any housing assistance? No. I rented a studio apartment above a pizza shop, then later moved to a small house that I bought with an FHA loan. Did your parents provide any of the down payment for that house? No. I saved the down payment by working 7 days a week and living on ramen noodles. The contrast with Claire's situation became clear as we reviewed my financial history. While she was receiving regular bailouts from our parents, I was reinvesting every profit back into the business. While she was taking expensive trips and maintaining a lifestyle she couldn't afford, I was driving a 10-year-old truck and wearing work clothes until they fell apart. Jake introduced the Henderson Commercial Plaza contract, the breakthrough project that had established Thompson Construction as a serious player in commercial development. I explained how I'd won the contract through competitive bidding, how I'd managed the project, how its success had led to bigger opportunities. Mr. Thompson, during the Henderson project, did you receive any assistance from your sister? Claire was living in California at the time, working on her art career. Did she offer to help with the project? She never asked about it. We rarely spoke during those years unless there was a family event. The most powerful evidence was the business growth chart Jake had prepared, showing Thompson Construction's revenue, employment, and profitability over 2 decades. The trajectory was clear, steady, consistent growth driven by reinvestment and reputation. There were no sudden jumps that might suggest outside investment, no periods of stagnation that might indicate family support was withdrawn. Mr. Thompson, has anyone besides you ever made a significant financial investment in Thompson Construction? No. Every dollar has come from business operations, either profits reinvested or loans secured by business assets. Has your sister ever worked for Thompson Construction in any capacity? Never. Has she ever provided any business advice, made any business decisions, or contributed to business operations in any way? No. Jake's questions became more specific, addressing each of Claire's claims individually. The family dinners where business was supposedly discussed. Brief conversations where Dad might ask how work was going, nothing more substantial than polite interest. The encouragement and support that allegedly contributed to my success. Generic family interactions that every sibling receives. Mr. Thompson, did your parents ever explicitly promise that family members would share in your business success? Never. They understood that I was building something independently. Did you ever promise your sister ownership in Thompson Construction? Absolutely not. She never showed any interest in the construction business. Jake then addressed the emotional core of Claire's case to argument that family should share everything. I explained how I'd always been self-sufficient while Claire had received extensive financial support. I described the different expectations our parents had for each of us, the different paths we'd chosen, the different values that had guided our decisions. I've never asked my family for financial help, I testified. I've always believed that what you earn, you keep, and what you achieve is the result of your own effort. Claire has always believed that family resources should be shared freely. Those are fundamentally different philosophies. The most difficult part of my testimony came when Jake asked about my relationship with Claire and my feelings about her lawsuit. Mr. Thompson, what was your reaction when your sister demanded 50% ownership of your company? I looked at Claire, who was staring at the table in front of her. I was shocked and hurt. I couldn't understand how someone could claim half of something they'd never contributed to, never worked for, never earned. Do you love your sister? The question caught me off guard. Yes, I love Claire. I want her to be happy and successful, but I won't sacrifice everything I've built to enable her poor financial decisions. Hoffman's cross-examination was aggressive but ineffective. He tried to make me seem cold and calculating, a brother who valued money more than family relationships. He pressed me on childhood memories, trying to find evidence of promises or agreements that might support Claire's case. Mr. Thompson, didn't you ever tell your sister that you would take care of her? In general terms, maybe? The way any brother might say he'd look out for his sister? But I never promised her ownership in my business. Didn't your family teach you to share? Yes, when I was 5 years old, but that doesn't mean sharing everything I own as an adult with people who haven't earned it. You've become quite wealthy from Thompson Construction, haven't you? I've been successful. Yes. And your sister has struggled financially. Yes, because of choices she's made. So you think she deserves to struggle? I think she deserves the consequences of her decisions, just like I deserve the benefits of mine. Hoffman tried to characterize me as heartless, but the financial evidence was too overwhelming. The jury could see that I'd built Thompson Construction through decades of hard work while Claire had coasted on family subsidies. They could see that my success was earned while her financial problems were self-inflicted. The defense's second witness was Jim Bradley, the client who'd given me the Henderson project and several contracts since. He testified about my reputation in the industry, my professionalism, my independence as a business owner. Did you ever deal with any family members of Mr. Thompson's in your business relationship? Never. Marcus runs his operation completely independently. I've never seen any evidence of family involvement in business decisions. We also called several employees who'd worked for Thompson Construction for over a decade. They testified about my hands-on management style, my personal investment in every project, my commitment to quality and worker safety. None of them had ever heard mention of family ownership or involvement, but the most devastating witness was Rebecca Chen, the private investigator. Jake had decided to reveal Claire's gambling addiction, and Rebecca's testimony was clinical and thorough. She presented evidence of casino visits, online gambling accounts, debts to illegal lenders, and the pattern of borrowing money from family to fund gambling losses. In your professional opinion, Jake asked, would giving Ms. Thompson partial ownership of a business be financially prudent? No, Rebecca said without hesitation. Based on her financial history, any assets she gained access to would likely be gambled away within months. Hoffman objected repeatedly during Rebecca's testimony, but the damage was done. The jury now understood why Claire needed money so desperately, and why giving her half of my company would be like pouring gasoline on a fire. Claire's addiction explained everything: the constant financial crises, the inability to maintain any business venture, the willingness to sue her own brother for money she hadn't earned. She wasn't a struggling artist deserving family support. She was a gambling addict who would destroy anything she could access to feed her compulsion. As we concluded the defense case, I felt confident that we'd proven our point. Thompson Construction was mine, built through my own efforts without family, investment, or assistance. Claire's demand for ownership was based on entitlement, rather than contribution, driven by addiction rather than equity. The jury would now decide whether family relationships created ownership rights, or whether success earned through honest work belonged to the person who'd earned it. The loan documents from First National Bank told a story that even Claire's most skilled attorney couldn't spin into something positive. Jake spread them across the evidence table like a detective revealing the final piece of a puzzle. Each page another nail in the coffin of Claire's credibility. Your Honor, Jake announced, the defense would like to introduce Exhibit 47 loan applications submitted by the plaintiff over the past 3 years. Hoffman objected immediately. These documents are irrelevant to the ownership dispute. They're directly relevant to the plaintiff's credibility and her true motivations for this lawsuit. Jake replied. Judge Martinez reviewed the documents briefly, then nodded. I'll allow it. The jury may consider these materials when evaluating the plaintiff's testimony and claims. The first application was dated 18 months before Claire's visit to my office. She'd applied for a $50,000 personal loan, listing her income as freelance graphic design with monthly earnings of $3,000. The bank had requested documentation, and Claire had been unable to provide tax returns or client contracts to support her claimed income. More interesting was what she'd listed as collateral: 25% ownership stake in Thompson Construction, family business valued at approximately $500,000. Jake walked the jury through the implications. Ladies and gentlemen, this document proves that the plaintiff was planning to claim ownership in Thompson Construction long before she ever discussed it with my client. She was already telling banks that she owned part of his business, trying to use it as collateral for loans. The second application was even more damning. Claire had applied for a home equity line of credit, again listing Thompson Construction ownership as an asset. When the bank had requested documentation of her ownership stake, she'd submitted a handwritten document that purported to be a family business agreement. Jake showed the jury the fake agreement, a single page of text that claimed Marcus and Claire Thompson were equal partners in all family business ventures. It was signed only by Claire and dated just days before her loan application. "This is a fraudulent document," Jake said bluntly. "The plaintiff created it to deceive a bank into giving her a loan based on assets she doesn't own." Hoffman was on his feet again. "Objection. Counsel is making legal conclusions. Sustained. Mr. Morrison, please limit yourself to the facts." Jake nodded. "The facts are that this document was never signed by my client, never witnessed, never notarized, and never existed until the plaintiff needed it for a loan application. The bank rejected the application because they couldn't verify the ownership claim." The third document was the most revealing: a credit card application where Claire had listed her annual income as $75,000 and her assets as including partial ownership of successful construction company. Both claims were false. Her actual income was less than $20,000, and she owned no part of Thompson Construction. "Your Honor," Jake continued, "these documents establish a pattern of fraudulent behavior by the plaintiff. She's been claiming ownership of Thompson Construction for years, using these false claims to obtain credit and loans. This lawsuit isn't about family fairness, it's about legitimizing false claims she's already made to financial institutions." But the most devastating evidence came from Claire's own computer, which Rebecca Chen had examined as part of her investigation. Jake introduced printouts of internet searches Claire had conducted over the past 2 years. The plaintiff searched for terms like how to claim family business ownership, sibling partnership law, and forcing business partner to share profits. Jake told the jury, "She also researched my client's business extensively, looking up Thompson Construction's contracts, revenue estimates, and property holdings. The search history painted a picture of calculated planning rather than spontaneous family concern. Claire had been researching legal strategies for claiming ownership of my business, studying my financial situation, and planning her approach for months before finally making her demand." Jake then called Margaret Foster, a loan officer from First National Bank who had handled Claire's applications. She testified about the bank's investigation into Claire's ownership claims and their conclusion that the documents were fabricated. "We require extensive documentation for business ownership claims," Foster explained. "When we couldn't verify Ms. Thompson's alleged stake in Thompson Construction, we flagged the application as potentially fraudulent." "Did you report this to any authorities?" "We referred the matter to our fraud department, but Ms. Thompson withdrew her application before we completed our investigation." Hoffman tried to minimize the banking evidence during his redirect, suggesting that Claire had simply been optimistic about future family arrangements rather than deliberately deceptive. But the pattern was too clear. Claire had been lying to banks about owning part of my business long before she'd ever asked me for actual ownership. The emotional core of our counterattack came when Jake called my accountant, David Kim, who'd handled Thompson Construction's books for 15 years. David testified about the company's financial structure, its profitability, and the careful management that had built its success. "In your professional opinion," Jake asked, "would giving an inexperienced partner 50% ownership of Thompson Construction be financially sound?" "It would be catastrophic," David said without hesitation. "The company's success depends on careful financial management and long-term planning. Introducing a partner with no business experience and significant personal debts would likely destroy the company within 2 years." Jake then asked David to calculate what Claire's 50% ownership claim would be worth based on current business valuations. The number was staggering: nearly $2 million, far more than Claire had ever contributed to anything in her entire life. "Mr. Kim, has the plaintiff ever contributed any work, money, or expertise that would justify a $2 million ownership stake?" "No, she's never been involved with the company in any capacity." The final witness in our counterattack was Dr. Sarah Williams, a psychologist who specialized in gambling addiction. While she hadn't personally evaluated Claire, she'd reviewed the financial records and provided expert opinion about the behavioral patterns they revealed. "The evidence shows classic signs of compulsive gambling disorder," Dr. Williams testified. "The rapid borrowing and spending cycles, the deception about financial status, the increasing desperation for money, these are textbook symptoms of someone whose addiction is controlling their behavior. In your opinion, Would giving someone with these symptoms access to significant financial assets be advisable? Absolutely not. It would likely accelerate the addictive behavior and lead to the rapid loss of those assets. Hoffman's cross-examination was weak, focusing on the fact that Dr. Williams hadn't personally examined Claire. But the financial evidence spoke for itself. Claire's behavior over the past decade showed every sign of someone whose gambling addiction was destroying her judgment and moral compass. As our counterattack concluded, the courtroom atmosphere had shifted dramatically. What had started as a family dispute about fairness and sharing had been revealed as an attempted theft by a gambling addict who'd been planning to claim ownership of my business for years. Claire sat at the plaintiff's table looking smaller than she had at the beginning of the trial, her fake ownership claims exposed, her financial desperation laid bare for everyone to see. My parents were no longer looking supportive. Dad's expression was horrified as he learned about Claire's deception and addiction for the first time. The jury had heard the complete truth. I had built Thompson Construction through decades of honest work while Claire had spent those same years accumulating debt and gambling away every opportunity she'd been given. Her lawsuit wasn't about family values or fairness, it was about desperation, driving someone to try stealing what she'd never earned. Tomorrow would bring closing arguments, but the real case was already over. Claire's credibility was destroyed, her motives exposed, her claims revealed as fraudulent. The jury would have to decide whether to reward calculated deception or protect the fruits of honest labor. I already knew which side justice was on. The court judgment that ended this nightmare is framed on my office wall now, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of what happens when family entitlement collides with legal reality. Judge Martinez delivered his ruling from the bench after just 30 minutes of deliberation, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd seen every variation of family greed and had no patience for manufactured claims. This court has listened to 3 days of testimony regarding the plaintiff's demand for 50% ownership of Thompson Construction. Judge Martinez began, his reading glasses perched as he reviewed his notes. Having considered all evidence presented, I find the plaintiff's claims to be without merit both legally and factually. Claire sat rigidly at the plaintiff's table, her face pale but composed. Hoffman had clearly prepared her for this outcome, though I suspected even he was surprised by the harshness of the judge's language. The evidence shows conclusively that Thompson Construction was built by the defendant through his own labor, investment, and business acumen over a period of 22 years. The plaintiff has provided no evidence of financial contribution, work contribution, or any other form of investment that would justify an ownership claim. Judge Martinez paused, looking directly at Claire. More concerning to this court is the evidence of fraudulent misrepresentation. The plaintiff has repeatedly claimed ownership of Thompson Construction in loan applications and credit requests, using these false claims to obtain money from financial institutions. This behavior suggests that the current lawsuit is merely an attempt to legitimize previously false claims. My parents shifted uncomfortably in the gallery. This was the first time they were hearing the full scope of Claire's deception described by a judge in open court. Dad's face was ashen, while Mom clutched a tissue and stared at her hands. The plaintiff's attorney has argued that family relationships create moral obligations that should override legal requirements, the judge continued. This court categorically rejects that argument. Family membership does not create ownership rights. Being related to a successful business owner does not entitle someone to claim that success as their own. Judge Martinez's voice grew sharper. Furthermore, the evidence regarding the plaintiff's financial history raises serious concerns about her ability to manage business assets responsibly. The documented pattern of gambling, excessive borrowing, and financial mismanagement suggests that granting the plaintiff any ownership stake in Thompson Construction would be detrimental to the business and its employees. The judge's words hit the courtroom like physical blows. I could see Claire flinch with each point, her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. The court also notes the troubling evidence of premeditation in this case. The plaintiff began researching methods to claim business ownership months before making any demand on the defendant. She created fraudulent documents to support loan applications based on ownership claims that never existed. This lawsuit appears to be the culmination of a calculated plan to obtain assets through legal manipulation rather than legitimate entitlement. Judge Martinez removed his glasses and leaned forward slightly, his tone becoming more personal and direct. Ms. Thompson, this court has seen many family disputes over the years, and they are always tragic. But what makes this case particularly disturbing is your apparent belief that family relationships entitle you to the fruits of someone else's labor. Your brother built his business through decades of work, sacrifice, and responsible decisions. You have spent those same decades making poor financial choices and accumulating debt. The solution to your problems is not to claim half of what he has earned. It is to address the underlying issues that created your problems in the first place. Claire was crying now, quiet tears that she tried to hide behind her hand. The composed, confident woman who had walked into my office 6 months ago was gone, replaced by someone who looked broken and defeated. This court finds for the defendant on all counts, Judge Martinez announced. The plaintiff's claims for ownership, profit sharing and damages are denied in their entirety. Furthermore, given the evidence of fraudulent misrepresentation and the frivolous nature of this lawsuit, the court awards attorney's fees and costs to the defendant in the amount of $47,000. The attorney's fees award hit Claire like a physical blow. She had gambled not just with her own credibility but with money she didn't have, and now she owed nearly $50,000 on top of her existing debts. Mr. Hoffman, the judge continued, I want to be clear that this court expects the plaintiff to satisfy this judgment promptly. Any further attempts to claim ownership of Thompson Construction or to misrepresent such ownership to financial institutions will be considered contempt of court and potentially criminal fraud. Hoffman nodded glumly. He'd known this case was weak from the beginning, but he'd probably taken it on contingency, hoping for a settlement that would avoid the embarrassment of a trial. Now his client owed money she couldn't pay, and his reputation had taken a hit for bringing such a baseless case to court. As the judge concluded his remarks and court was adjourned, I felt a strange mix of vindication and sadness. I'd won completely. Claims were rejected, her credibility was destroyed, and the court had essentially called her a fraud. But watching my sister break down at the plaintiff's table, I couldn't take any joy in her humiliation. Jake gathered our papers efficiently, already thinking about the mechanics of collecting the attorney's fees. Congratulations, he said quietly. This was as decisive a victory as I've ever seen in family court. Claire remained seated as the courtroom cleared, her head down and her shoulders shaking. Hoffman was trying to console her, probably explaining the appeals process, though we both knew there were no grounds for appeal. The evidence had been overwhelming, the law clear, the judge's reasoning unassailable. My parents approached me hesitantly as I prepared to leave. Dad looked like he'd aged years in the past 3 days. Finally understanding the scope of Claire's deception and financial problems, Marcus, he said quietly, we owe you an apology. I looked at him, this man who'd worked hard his entire life, and done his best to raise 2 children with different needs and different challenges. You don't owe me anything, Dad. You were trying to help Claire. We didn't know, Mom said, her voice thick with tears, about the gambling, about the lies she told to banks. We thought she was just struggling to establish her career. I know, I said. She fooled all of us for a long time. Dad glanced back at Claire, who was still sitting at the plaintiff's table with her head in her hands. What happens now? She gets help, I said. Real help. For the gambling addiction, not more money to feed it. She owes you $47,000, Mom said. She can't pay that. I'd been thinking about this during the judge's remarks. Claire was broke, unemployed, and facing debts that would take years to repay even if she got her life together. The attorney's fees judgment was legally valid, but practically meaningless. You can't get blood from a stone. I'll work something out with Jake, I said. Maybe community service. Maybe a payment plan she can actually manage. I don't want to destroy her completely, but as I left the courthouse that day, I knew that some relationships can't be repaired. Claire and I would probably never speak again, not because of the money or the lawsuit, but because of the fundamental breach of trust that had made the lawsuit possible. She had looked at everything I'd built through 22 years of work and decided she deserved half of it for no reason other than sharing my DNA. She had lied to banks, deceived our parents, and tried to manipulate the legal system to steal what she'd never earned. The judge had laughed, not literally, but his dismissive tone and harsh language had the same effect. Claire's claims were so baseless, so obviously fraudulent, that they'd been rejected with the kind of judicial contempt usually reserved for the most frivolous lawsuits. Justice had been served, but it felt like a Pyrrhic victory. I'd protected my business and vindicated my principles, but I'd lost my sister in the process. The family that had raised us was permanently fractured, and the golden child who'd once painted watercolors at the kitchen table was revealed to be a gambling addict willing to destroy anyone to feed her compulsion. As I drove back to my office, I thought about the business I'd built and the price I'd paid to protect it. Thompson Construction would survive and continue to thrive, but the Thompson family might never recover from the damage Claire's greed had inflicted. Sometimes winning comes at a cost that makes victory feel like loss. The family photo sits in my desk drawer now, face down beneath a stack of invoices and project schedules. It's from Christmas 1987, when Claire was 12 and I was 14. Both of us grinning at the camera while Mom and Dad stand behind us with their hands on our shoulders. We look like any other family, happy, connected, unaware that years later we'd be adversaries in a courtroom. 3 weeks had passed since Judge Martinez's ruling, and the initial relief of victory had given way to something more complicated. I'd protected my business and vindicated my principles, but the cost was becoming clear. The Thompson family, as it had existed for 46 years, was effectively dead. Claire had disappeared after the trial, leaving Portland without forwarding information and apparently cutting off contact with everyone. Mom called me twice a week now. Updates that consisted mostly of we still haven't heard from her and worried speculation about where she might be. Dad had grown quieter, spending long hours in his workshop building birdhouses that no one would ever use. The silence from Claire was probably for the best. What would we say to each other? How do you rebuild a relationship after someone tries to steal half of everything you've worked for? How do you trust someone who's spent years lying to banks about owning part of your business? But the silence from my parents was harder to accept. They called regularly, but our conversations were stilted, careful, full of topics we couldn't discuss. They'd been forced to confront truths about their golden child that shattered decades of carefully constructed illusions. Claire wasn't a struggling artist deserving their support. She was a gambling addict who'd manipulated their love to fund her self-destruction. The worst part was seeing how the revelation had aged them. Dad looked exhausted, carrying the weight of realizing he'd enabled Claire's addiction through years of financial bailouts. Mom seemed fragile, questioning every decision they'd made about raising us, wondering if their favoritism had created the monster that had tried to destroy me. We did the best we could, she said during one of our awkward phone calls. We thought we were helping her follow her dreams. You were, I replied, because what else could I say? They had done their best with the information they had. They couldn't have known that their financial support was feeding an addiction, that their encouragement was enabling delusion, that their love was being weaponized against their own son. Business was good better than good, actually. Word had spread through the construction community about the lawsuit and its outcome, and clients seemed more confident than ever in Thompson Construction's stability and independence. We'd landed 2 major projects since the trial, and I was considering hiring additional staff to handle the workload, but success felt hollow when there was no family to share it with. I'd spent 22 years building something I was proud of, and now the people who should have been proudest of my achievements were either gone or too guilt-ridden to celebrate with me. Jake Morrison had worked out a payment plan for the attorneys, fees that Claire could theoretically manage if she got her life together, $50 a month for the next 78 years. It was more symbolic than practical, but it satisfied the court's requirement that the judgment be addressed. I suspected I'd never see a penny of that money, and I was okay with that. The real victory wasn't financial, it was the principle that had been established. You can't claim ownership of something you didn't build, regardless of your last name. You can't demand half of someone's success just because you share their DNA. Family relationships create emotional bonds, not legal obligations to share wealth. I thought about that principle often during the quiet evenings in my house. The home I'd bought with money I'd earned through honest work, every piece of furniture, every improvement, every payment, had come from Thompson Construction's profits. No one had given me anything. No one had invested in my success. No one had made my achievements possible except me. That independence had cost me my family, but it had also given me something that couldn't be taken away, the knowledge that everything I owned was truly mine. When I looked around my office, my house, my business, I saw the fruits of my own labor. No one could claim credit for what I'd built, and no one could demand a share of what I'd earned. The employee Christmas party that year was subdued. My crew knew about the lawsuit. It had been impossible to keep it quiet, and they seemed to sense my conflicted mood about the victory. These people depended on Thompson Construction for their livelihoods, and they understood that Claire's lawsuit had threatened not just my financial security, but theirs as well. Boss, said Tommy Rodriguez, my senior foreman, during the party, I just want you to know we're glad you fought that thing. This company means something to all of us. That meant more to me than any judge's ruling. These 12 people had families to support, mortgages to pay, futures to plan. Thompson Construction wasn't just my achievement, it was their security. Protecting the business meant protecting them, and that responsibility weighed more heavily than any family obligation ever could. During the holidays, I visited my parents alone for the first time in decades. The house felt different without Claire's presence, smaller somehow, as if her absence had changed the fundamental geometry of family gatherings. We opened presents and shared dinner, but there was a chair at the table that remained empty, the space that reminded us all of what we'd lost. She'll come back, Mom said as I was leaving. When she's ready, she'll come home. I nodded and kissed her goodbye, but I didn't believe it. Claire had burned bridges that couldn't be rebuilt, told lies that couldn't be forgotten, revealed a side of herself that couldn't be unseen. Even if she overcame her gambling addiction, even if she got her life together, the trust that had once existed between us was gone forever. Driving home that night, I thought about the different paths Claire and I had chosen. She'd been given every advantage: financial support, emotional encouragement, multiple chances to succeed. She'd squandered all of it through poor decisions and addictive behavior, then tried to claim half of what I'd built independently. I'd chosen the harder paths: freelance, delayed gratification, building something slowly and carefully without shortcuts or bailouts. It had taken 22 years to create Thompson Construction, but every brick, every beam, every dollar of profit was honestly earned. The family photo would stay in my desk drawer, a reminder of what we'd once been and what we'd lost, but I wouldn't let nostalgia cloud the reality of what had happened. Claire had tried to steal half of my life's work, and I'd stopped her. That wasn't a family tragedy, it was justice served. The no-contact order arrived certified mail on a Tuesday morning in March, 6 months after the trial that had ended Claire's lawsuit. The legal document was brief and clinical. but its implications were profound. My sister had violated the court's instructions about not misrepresenting ownership of Thompson Construction, and now she was legally prohibited from contacting me directly. Jake Morrison called that afternoon to explain what had happened. Claire applied for another loan using Thompson Construction as collateral. He said, the bank contacted us to verify her ownership claim, and when we informed them of the court judgment, they reported it as attempted fraud. I sat in my office staring at the no-contact order and feeling a complex mix of sadness and relief. Relief that Claire could no longer harass me or make false claims about my business. Sadness that my sister had learned nothing from her court defeat and was still trying to monetize assets she'd never owned. Where is she now? I asked. Las Vegas. According to the bank records, she listed a casino hotel as her address on the loan application. Of course she was in Las Vegas. Claire had hit bottom and kept digging, trading one gambling venue for another, apparently convinced that her next bet would solve all her problems. The little girl who'd painted watercolors at our kitchen table had become someone I no longer recognized, someone whose addiction had consumed every vestige of the person she'd once been. The no-contact order was actually a relief. For months, I'd been dreading the possibility that Claire might call or show up at my office, demanding another conversation about fairness and family obligations. The legal barrier meant I could focus on rebuilding my life without looking over my shoulder for the next attempted manipulation. But healing from family trauma required more than legal protection. It required conscious effort to establish new relationships and new sources of emotional support. I'd spent so many years focused on building my business that I'd neglected the personal side of my life, and Claire's lawsuit had made that isolation painfully obvious. I started attending a support group for small business owners, initially for practical reasons, but gradually for the camaraderie. These were people who understood the challenges of building something from nothing, the sacrifices required to create lasting success, the loneliness that came with being responsible for other people's livelihoods. Family can be the biggest obstacle to business success, said Margaret Chen, who owned a successful accounting firm. They see your achievements and think they're entitled to benefit without contributing. Setting boundaries isn't necessary. Margaret became a friend, then eventually something more. She understood the demands of running a business because she faced them daily in her own company. She appreciated the dedication required to build something lasting because she'd made similar sacrifices. When I told her about Claire's lawsuit, she nodded knowingly rather than suggesting I should have been more generous with family. You can't enable someone's addiction by giving them what they want, she said over dinner one evening. That's not love, it's codependence. Thompson Construction continued to thrive under my undivided attention. Without the distraction of family drama, I was able to focus completely on growing the business strategically rather than defensively. We landed a contract to build a new municipal complex, the largest project in our company's history, and I promoted 2 longtime employees to senior management positions. The success felt different now, cleaner somehow. Every decision was mine, every profit was earned, every achievement was the result of choices I'd made without interference from family expectations or obligations. I'd learned to value independence, not just for its practical benefits but for its emotional freedom. My relationship with my parents slowly improved as the shock of Claire's behavior faded and they began to understand my perspective. Dad started calling occasionally just to chat about work, finally showing genuine interest in what I'd built. Mom sent articles she'd clipped from magazines about successful construction companies, small gestures that acknowledged my achievements in ways she'd never done before. We're proud of you, Dad said during one of our conversations. We should have said that more often. It was never too late for that kind of recognition, though I'd learned not to depend on external validation for my sense of worth. The approval that mattered most was my own, the knowledge that I'd built something meaningful. Through honest effort and principled decisions, the employees at Thompson Construction had become my chosen family, people who shared my commitment to quality work and mutual respect. We celebrated project completions together, supported each other through personal challenges, and created the kind of workplace culture that attracted talented people who wanted to stay long-term. This place feels different from other companies, said Linda Murphy, a project coordinator I'd hired recently. People actually care about each other here. That culture hadn't happened by accident. It was the result of treating people fairly, sharing success through bonuses and profit sharing, and creating an environment where everyone's contributions were valued. The family dynamics I'd never been able to establish with my blood relatives had emerged naturally in my professional relationships. I bought a larger house that year, a craftsman-style home that I renovated myself during weekends and evenings. Every improvement was a choice I made for my own satisfaction. Every expense was justified by my own priorities. Every decision reflected my own values rather than family expectations or obligations. The workshop in the basement became my sanctuary, a place where I could work with my hands on projects that had no commercial purpose but brought me satisfaction. Building bookcases, refinishing furniture, creating functional beauty that would outlast me. These activities connected me to the same impulses that had driven me to start Thompson Construction decades earlier. Margaret often joined me in the workshop, helping with projects that required two sets of hands, or simply keeping me company while I worked. We talked about business challenges, shared stories about difficult clients, planned vacations to places neither of us had ever seen. She understood that my workshop time was essential to my mental health, just as her evening piano practice was essential to hers. "You're different from when I first met you," she observed one evening as I finished sanding a cabinet door. "More relaxed, more confident." I thought about that observation. The constant tension of family expectations, the guilt about not doing enough for Claire, the anxiety about maintaining relationships that required me to sacrifice my own interests, all of that was gone. I'd established boundaries that protected my peace of mind and my financial security, and the result was a sense of freedom I'd never experienced before. The no-contact order had been meant as protection, but it had become liberation. I no longer had to worry about Claire's next crisis, no longer had to justify my success to people who hadn't contributed to it, no longer had to balance family obligations against business responsibilities. I was free to build the life I wanted, rather than the life others expected me to provide. The new business partnership agreement I signed last month represents everything I've learned about trust, boundaries, and the difference between earned relationships and assumed entitlements. My partner, David Kruger, is a former client who approached me about expanding Thompson Construction into green building technologies. Unlike Claire's demand for unearned ownership, David brings capital, expertise, and a track record of success. In sustainable construction, the contract took 3 months to negotiate, with every detail carefully specified, every responsibility clearly defined, every contingency anticipated. David will invest $2 million and provide specialized knowledge about renewable energy systems. I will contribute Thompson Construction's reputation, client base, and operational expertise. Our partnership is based on mutual benefit rather than family obligation, professional respect rather than genetic accident. This is how business partnerships should work, Jake Morrison said as we finalized the agreement. Both parties bring value, both parties benefit, both parties have clear expectations. It's been 2 years since Claire's lawsuit, and the perspective that comes with time has helped me understand what really happened in that courtroom. It wasn't just about money or business ownership, it was about two fundamentally different philosophies of life. Colliding in the most public way possible, Claire believed that family membership entitled her to share in my success, regardless of her contribution. She saw my achievements as proof of inequality rather than evidence of effort, my independence as selfishness rather than her worldview required that success be redistributed based on need rather than earned through merit. I believe that what you build belongs to you, that success comes from discipline and sacrifice, that helping others starts with not enabling their poor decisions. My worldview requires that benefits be earned through contribution rather than claimed through relationship. Neither philosophy is inherently evil, but they're incompatible when it comes to business partnerships or financial obligations. Claire needed me to subsidize her lifestyle and enable her addiction. I needed to protect what I'd built and maintain the principles that had made that building possible. The lawsuit forced me to choose between family, harmony, and personal integrity, and I chose integrity. The cost was permanent estrangement from my sister and lasting tension with my parents. But the alternative would have been worse, the slow destruction of everything I'd worked for, funding an addiction that would have consumed whatever resources I could access. Thompson Construction employs 18 people now, up from the 12 we had during the lawsuit. The new employees know nothing about my family drama to them. I'm simply the owner of a successful company that provides steady work and fair wages. That anonymity is refreshing, a reminder that most people judge you by your actions rather than your relationships. My parents have accepted the new reality. Though it took time, Dad visits the office occasionally, finally showing genuine interest in what I've built rather than polite disinterest. Mom sends birthday cards and holiday gifts, small gestures that acknowledge our relationship while respecting the boundaries I have established. We understand why you did what you had to do, Dad said during our last conversation. We just wish it hadn't come to that. I wish it hadn't either, but wishing doesn't change reality. Claire made choices that led inevitably to that courtroom confrontation. I made choices that led to protecting what I'd earned. The collision was unfortunate but unavoidable given our different values and priorities. The support group I joined has become an important part of my life. A monthly gathering of business owners who understand the unique challenges of building something from nothing. We share war stories about difficult clients, celebrate each other's successes, provide advice during challenging times. These relationships are based on shared experience rather than shared DNA, chosen rather than inherited. Family is who shows up for you, said Tom Bradley during one of our meetings. Sometimes that's blood relatives, sometimes it's people you choose. What matters is the showing up, not the genetics. Tom's observation resonated with me because it captured something I'd learned through painful experience. My employees showed up every day, contributing their skills to our shared success. Margaret showed up emotionally, supporting my goals without trying to claim credit for my achievements. My business partners showed up financially, investing their resources in ventures we built together. Claire had never shown up for me in any meaningful way. She'd been absent during my struggles, indifferent to my achievements, and present only when she wanted something I'd earned. Family loyalty has to flow both ways to be meaningful. You can't demand someone's support while offering nothing in return. The advice I give to other business owners who face family pressure is simple. Establish clear boundaries early and maintain them consistently. Family members who genuinely care about your success will respect those boundaries. Family members who see your success as their opportunity will challenge those boundaries constantly. Don't enable dysfunction in the name of family loyalty. I told a young contractor whose brother was demanding a job he wasn't qualified for. Helping someone means supporting their growth, not subsidizing their poor decisions. That distinction between helping and enabling had taken me too long to understand. For years, I'd felt guilty about my parents' financial support for Claire, as if my success somehow obligated me to compensate for their sacrifices. I'd confused family loyalty with financial responsibility, emotional support with monetary contribution. Now I understand that real loyalty means protecting the family from destructive behavior, even when that behavior comes from family members. Giving Claire half of Thompson Construction wouldn't have helped her overcome her gambling addiction. It would have provided more money to feed that addiction while destroying the business my employees depended on. The workshop in my basement has become a place of meditation and reflection, where I work on projects that have no commercial purpose but provide deep satisfaction, building furniture that will outlast me, restoring tools that connect me to previous generations of craftsmen, creating functional beauty that serves no purpose except to exist. These activities remind me why I love construction work. Margaret often joins me there, reading while I work or helping with projects that require extra hands. Our relationship has grown slowly and carefully, based on mutual respect and shared values rather than desperate need or convenient timing. She understands my commitment to independence because she shares it. She appreciates my work ethic because she demonstrates the same dedication in her own business. "You're a different person than you were when we met," she observed recently. "More confident, more peaceful." The confidence comes from knowing that everything I own was honestly earned, that every success was built through my own effort, that no one can claim credit for what I've achieved. The peace comes from establishing boundaries that protect my values while allowing relationships to develop naturally rather than through obligation. If I could go back and change how things developed with Claire, I would. I'd establish boundaries earlier, refuse to enable her poor decisions from the beginning, force her to confront her addiction before it consumed her completely. But I can't change the past. I can only learn from it and build a better future. The future I'm building includes Thompson Construction's continued growth, a partnership with David that expands our capabilities, a relationship with Margaret that enriches both our lives, and friendships based on mutual respect rather than genetic accident. It includes parents who finally understand what I've accomplished, and employees who depend on the business I've built responsibly. Most importantly, it includes the knowledge that success earned through honest work belongs to the person who earned it, regardless of family expectations or social pressure to share unearned wealth. That principle cost me a sister, but it preserved my integrity and protected everything I'd worked to create. Sometimes the right choice is also the hard choice. Sometimes protecting what you've built requires disappointing people you love. Sometimes family loyalty means saying no to family members who would destroy what you've created. I learned all of these lessons the hard way, but I learned them thoroughly. The judge who dismissed Claire's lawsuit didn't just reject her legal claims, he validated the principle that merit matters more than relationship. That contribution creates ownership, that success belongs to those who earn it. That validation was worth fighting for, worth the cost it demanded, worth the family relationships it complicated. In the end, justice prevailed, and that's what matters most.